storm that night was unlike anything the small neighborhood had seen in years. Winds tore through the narrow lanes, pushing trash bins across the road, rattling windows, and drowning the city in sheets of cold rain. Most families shut their doors tightly, refusing to step outside for even a second. But on the edge of the neighborhood, in a rundown single-room home with a leaking roof, a poor woman named Mary pressed her palm against the glass and watched the storm rage. Her life had always been about poverty, long shifts, and a world that judged her skin before her character. She had seen enough hardship to recognize when someone else was in danger. Even if she barely had anything left to give, that's when she noticed the blurry shape outside. A man soaked, stumbling, carried a frail young girl in his arms. He looked desperate, shivering as he tried to shield the child from the rain. No umbrella, no coat, no car nearby. Just exhaustion, fear, and a child whose breathing looked painfully shallow. Every other house stayed dark, curtains closed, doors locked. Miriam hesitated only for a second. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know the risks. She didn't know that this broken man was hiding a truth bigger than anything she could imagine. All she saw was a father fighting to keep his child alive, and within minutes, the act of kindness she chose that stormy night would change her entire life. Miriam pushed her creaking door open wider, letting the storm's roar fill the tiny room. Rainwater rushed across the threshold, trailing behind the man as he stepped inside with the fragile girl in his arms. He looked exhausted, clothes soaked to the skin, hair plastered against his forehead, breath trembling from cold and panic. The little girl's head rested limply against his chest, her skin alarmingly pale. Miriam quickly guided him toward the only dry corner of her room, clearing away a stack of old blankets she used for sleeping. Her home was small, barely enough space for one person, but tonight none of that mattered. She grabbed the kettle, the old rusted one she used every winter, and put it on the tiny stove to boil water. The flickering flame cast a warm glow around the room, softening the harshness of the storm outside, as the man lowered the girl onto the makeshift bedding. Miriam noticed something unusual. His hands, though trembling, were smooth, not like those of a struggling laborer. His watch, though scratched and dirty from the rain, was unmistakably expensive. But his face, it held a kind of quiet sorrow that no wealth could mask. There was no arrogance, no entitlement. Just a terrified father clinging to hope. The girl shivered violently, her breath short and irregular. Miriam knelt beside her and gently covered her with dry blankets. The cold in her skin felt dangerous, the kind that slipped deeper than the surface. Instinctively, she reached for the warm cloths she kept for winter nights and placed them around the child's hands and feet. Mind raced through memories of her own childhood. The fevered nights when her mother struggled to soothe her with home remedies because hospitals were too expensive and too far. She had grown up learning to manage illness with whatever little they had. Tonight, that experience became her guide. The man watched anxiously, eyes searching for reassurance. Miriam noticed his breathing was uneven, not from physical exhaustion, but from emotional fear. He looked like someone unfamiliar with helplessness, someone used to control solutions and resources. Yet here he was, lost in a poor woman's home, relying on nothing but her kindness. Outside, thunder crashed again, shaking the thin metal roof. The lights flickered as the electricity fought the storm's wrath. Miriam moved quickly, lighting a small lantern just in case the power failed. She placed it beside the girl, letting its warm glow cast steadiness where the storm threatened chaos. The man seemed startled by these small gestures of care, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were gentle, something he might not have received in a long time. Miriam finally settled beside the girl, adjusting the blanket around her neck. She sensed more than illness here. The child's breathing had a strain to it, a tightness that spoke of days, not minutes, of suffering. They had been outside for too long. The storm was only part of the story, as the kettle hissed. Miriam poured warm water into a cup and placed it near the man, urging him silently to take a sip. He hesitated, perhaps unsure if he should accept, but the trembling in his hands told her he needed it. When he finally wrapped his fingers around the cup, his shoulders dropped slightly. as if the warmth seeped into his bones and pulled him back to the moment. The girl let out a weak sound, barely a whisper. Her father leaned forward instantly, fear tightening his posture. Miriam placed a hand near the girl's forehead. It was burning now, rising fast. The storm outside had brought cold, but fever had made a home inside her body. Miriam knew what she must do next. She grabbed the old cloths again, soaking them in the warm water, then placed them gently along the girl's temples, chest, and wrists. Small actions, but necessary ones. Actions that came naturally to someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others despite having so little herself. The man watched her with conflicted gratitude mixed with something else. Confusion, perhaps. Why would a stranger offer so much? Why would a woman who clearly lived on the edge of survival choose to carry someone else's burden? Because Miriam had known loneliness. She had known nights when no one came to help, and she refused to let another child feel that same hopelessness. Minutes passed. The storm raged. The girl's breathing steadied just enough for her father to exhale the breath he'd been holding. The warmth from the blanket softened the stiffness in her small body, allowing some relief to seep back in. Miriam sat quietly beside them, her presence steady, unintrusive, protective. She offered nothing but compassion, yet it felt like the most valuable thing in the world. The man, still shaking, lowered his head. His expensive watch glinted under the lantern light. His shoes, though covered in mud, were clearly high quality. His entire appearance contradicted the situation he was in. But Miriam didn't question him. She didn't ask who he was or why he carried his daughter through a storm. Kindness. Didn't need answers. What? She didn't know what. She had no reason to imagine. Was that the man she was sheltering tonight? Controlled empires, businesses, an influence beyond anything her world had ever touched. A billionaire hidden under the weight of desperation. But the world had never been equal not for people like Miriam, whose skin and status often placed her at the bottom of society's ladder. She had spent a lifetime being judged, ignored, and overlooked. Tonight, however, fate had chosen her humble home as the last sanctuary for a child who desperately needed saving, and by the time the storm passed, their lives would be tied together by something far deeper than coincidence. The storm outside continued to beat against the fragile roof, but inside the tiny room, a strange stillness began to settle. The girl's breathing, once quick and shallow, became a little steadier under the warmth of Miriam's care. The man watched every tiny movement, every rise and fall of her chest. As if each breath held his world together, Miriam sat across from them, her back resting against the worn wall. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, not from cold, but from the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. She had taken in strangers before, hungry children, lost travelers, but nothing like this. This situation felt heavier, more fragile, more unpredictable. The man kept adjusting the blanket around his daughter, as if afraid that even a whisper of cold would take her away from him. Every movement in his hands spoke of fear, guilt, and an exhaustion far deeper than the sleepless night. He looked like someone carrying more than just a child. He carried secrets, burdens, and the kind of loneliness only wealth and tragedy could create together. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the room in a burst of white. The little girl flinched slightly, her eyelids tightening. The man instinctively placed a gentle hand on her forehead, his thumb trembling as he brushed her hair aside. It wasn't the touch of authority or power, it was the raw touch of a father terrified of losing the thing he truly cared about. Miriam watched quietly. From where she sat, she noticed the details, the shoes, far too expensive for someone wandering the streets, the quality of the jacket beneath the mud and rain stains, the subtle confidence in the way he carried himself, even in fear. He wasn't someone used to waiting or hoping or asking. He was someone accustomed to solving, too commanding, too fixing. And tonight, he couldn't fix anything. The girl let out a weak cough, her small frame curling inward. Miriam immediately moved to her side, holding a cloth to support her head. Her mind ran through the symptoms: cold exposure, fever, shallow breathing. It wasn't just the storm. This child had been sick long before stepping into her home. She dipped another cloth in warm water, pressed it gently to the girl's neck. The man's eyes followed her every movement, as if memorizing each act of care. He opened his mouth once, as if to speak, but no words came. The quiet between them carried stories neither had shared. Minutes stretched slowly. The lantern flickered softly, casting warm light on the girl's face. Outside, the storm began to soften, though raindrops still tapped against the metal roof in uneven patterns. The world beyond Miriam's door was still dark, but inside, something gentle was growing, something fragile but undeniably present. As Miriam worked, she couldn't help noticing the way the man's hand shook every time he adjusted the blanket. It wasn't the cold. It was fear, a deep, consuming fear that she had seen only once before, in a man whose wife had collapsed on the street years ago. The same trembling, the same helplessness, the same desperate search for hope. But unlike that moment, tonight she sensed something else beneath his fear, something unspoken, something heavy. Time passed, and the girl's fever finally eased a little. Her breathing became less erratic. She wasn't recovering fully far from it, but she was no longer on the edge of collapse. The man exhaled shakily, his shoulders lowering as if the world's weight had eased just enough for him to breathe again. But Miriam noticed something else. He hadn't stopped shivering, not from cold, but from the storm inside his own heart. Without a word, she stood and poured hot tea into a cracked cup, the only one she owned. She placed it beside him. He hesitated. For a long moment, looking at it as if unsure whether he deserved such kindness. When he finally wrapped his hands around the cup, the steam softened the tension in his fingers. He bowed his head slightly and unspoken. "Thank you." The rain continued outside, a steady rhythm now. The worst of the storm had passed, but its aftermath was only beginning. After some time, Miriam shifted back against the wall and studied the man quietly. The silence between them grew heavy, not uncomfortable, but filled with unsaid truths. She sensed something troubled him beyond his daughter's illness. Fear. Not just for her life, but for something larger lurking behind their arrival. Her home had always been small, but her intuition had always been large. She finally understood. This man wasn't hiding from the storm. He was hiding from the world. A world that would never expect a billionaire to be walking in the rain carrying a sick child. A world that worshipped his money, but would never imagine him without it. A world that judged people like Miriam for being poor, judged people like him for being powerful. Two opposite realities now shared one tiny room, and in that moment, fate began stitching a thread between them, one woven from desperation, compassion, and the irony of life's unpredictable storms. Hours passed. The girl's breathing steadied enough for her to sleep. The man finally allowed his body to lean back against the wall. Exhaustion overtook him, and his eyes drifted closed for the first time in what seemed like days. Miriam watched. The two of them, father and daughter, curled together in a poor woman's home. Sheltered not by wealth or power, but by the simple kindness of someone society never looked at twice. She kept the lantern burning through the night, determined to stay awake in case the fever returned. But as the storm outside began fading into early dawn, something unexpected happened. The girl stirred. Her small fingers moved. Her eyelids fluttered. Miriam leaned forward, hope rising cautiously, and then, in a faint whisper of life returning, the child breathed deeper, steady, warm. Gamda man's eyes shot open instantly. He looked at her, at his daughter, at Miriam. And for the first time, a fragile, breaking expression of gratitude crossed his face, not the polished gratitude of a wealthy man, but the raw, vulnerable gratitude of someone who had been saved by a stranger society expected nothing from. And this was only the beginning, because when morning came, everything they believed about each other and the world would be tested. The sun began to rise slowly, its pale light slipping through the broken slats of Miriam's window. Storm clouds outside were thinning, leaving behind a world washed clean yet heavy with the aftermath. But inside the small room, something far heavier was about to unfold. The little girl, though still weak, had stabilized through the night. Her breathing was slower, steadier. The fever had loosened its grip enough for her tiny fingers to curl and uncurl softly. But the moment daylight touched her face, a faint trembling began, subtle but unmistakable. Miriam noticed it instantly and moved closer, placing a gentle hand near the girl's forehead. Not fever, warmth, body warmth, life warmth. But before she could prepare fresh cloths, a loud knock echoed through the door. Sharp, aggressive. The kind of knock that didn't seek entry, only control. Miriam froze. The man stiffened instantly, his entire posture transforming. In one heartbeat, from exhausted father to someone bracing for impact, a sort of primal alertness filled his eyes, fear, urgency, and something like recognition. The knock came again, harder this time. Miriam swallowed. Visitors never came to her door this early. People rarely came at all. The man shifted forward, placing his body protectively near his daughter. His hands trembled, but not from weakness this time, from dread. The knocking continued, persistent and unkind. And then a voice sliced through the wooden door. "We know you're inside. Open it." Miriam's blood ran cold. The tone wasn't familiar, but it was the tone she had heard many times in her life. Entitlement. Superiority. The voice of someone who believed they had power over her simply because of who she was and where she lived. She stepped slowly toward the door, but before she reached it, the man shook his head violently. "Please," he whispered, not with words, but with eyes overflowing in desperation. "Don't." Miriam paused, torn between fear and compassion. She looked back toward the little girl, her small chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm, and then to the man whose entire world depended on this child's survival. The knocking stopped. Out. Heavy silence stretched. Then the doorknob turned. Miriam stepped forward quickly, gripping the handle with both hands. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to force their way into a poor woman's home. The world often felt it could push people like her aside without consequence. With every bit of strength she had, she held on. The door rattled violently. Footsteps shifted outside. Someone spoke again. "Sir, we're here to take you home." A different voice now, richer, formal, urgent. The man's head fell into his hands. His shoulders shook as he closed his eyes. Miriam realized the truth instantly. Whoever stood outside, they weren't strangers. They were his people. Another knock came, less forceful but filled with impatience. "Sir, the board is panicking. The media is searching. Your staff has been out all night. Please open the door." The truth hit Miriam like a slow, heavy weight. He wasn't just wealthy. He wasn't someone who had once been rich. He was someone whose absence could shake cities. The billionaire she had unknowingly sheltered. A man hidden beneath mud, rain, and fear, yet carrying a life so different from hers that the world bent around him. She stared at him, not in shock, not in awe, but in quiet, steady understanding. The girl whimpered softly, pulling both their attention. Miriam knelt beside her again, adjusting the blankets as the knocking continued. The billionaire moved closer to his daughter, touching her cheek gently, a father before anything else. Outside, another voice snapped sharply. "If you don't open, we'll force entry. You need medical care immediately. The child does too." Medical care, safety, resources. All the things Miriam wished she could offer, but never had. And the billionaire looked at his daughter with guilt so deep it fractured his expression. He'd been running not from enemies, but from a world that judged him, expected perfection, demanded appearances. A world where failing to protect his child wasn't just tragedy, it was scandal. And yet here, in the home of a woman society ignored, he had found the only real refuge he had left. He stood shakily, his eyes meeting Miriam's. In them she saw the unspoken truth. He needed to open the door, for his daughter, for her safety, for her life. But he also feared what would happen next, because wealth had never protected him from the racism his daughter faced, from the judgment Miriam faced, from the cruelty of a society that looked at skin and status long before it looked at humanity. For the first time, Miriam spoke not with her voice, but with firmness in her posture. She stood beside him, placing a hand on the doorknob, and took a slow breath. She wasn't helping a billionaire. She was helping a father. She wasn't afraid anymore. With a final look at him, she turned the handle. The door opened. A flood of well-dressed security guards, assistants, and medical personnel rushed in. Their eyes scanned the room, its peeling paint, its broken roof, smallness, and their expressions shifted from relief to judgment in seconds. Whispers spread. Disapproval flickered. Suspicion rose. Why was he here? Why would a man of his status be inside a home like this? Why with a poor woman? Why with a child in danger? But before anyone could speak, the little girl stirred, letting out a stronger breath than before. Silence fell. The billionaire knelt beside her, gathering her into his arms with trembling relief. The medical team moved quickly to evaluate her. Shock registered as they noticed the warm cloths, the improvised care, the steadying signs of recovery. They understood instantly that the girl's life had been preserved not by machines, but by a woman society believed had nothing to give. The billionaire looked up at Miriam, not as a man above her, not as someone rescued, but as someone humbled. And in that moment, every assumption, every boundary, every invisible line society had drawn between them shattered, because kindness had done what wealth could not. You said. For a long moment, the room remained suspended in silence. The medical team continued checking the girl's pulse and breathing, their expressions shifting from tense urgency to quiet surprise. The fever had broken. Her breathing, though soft, carried strength. Her skin held warmth again. The girl who had been fading away only hours ago was now holding on to life with renewed steadiness. The billionaire lowered his forehead onto his daughter's small hand, his breath shaking with a mixture of relief and grief. He had spent endless nights searching for solutions, moving from hospital to hospital, fighting against the limits of medicine. And yet it was this humble room, this poor woman's simple care, that had brought his daughter back from the brink. His assistant approached nervously, clutching a tablet filled with messages, alerts, and calls. The world outside was waiting for explanations, investors, news channels, board members, and critics. But none of that mattered now. Not when his daughter's heartbeat was returning beneath his fingers. He finally stood up, still holding the child in his arms, and looked at Miriam. She stood quietly by the wall, her hands folded together, unsure where she belonged in this sudden flood of wealth, urgency, and polished chaos. Her clothes were simple. Her house was worn. Her life was small in the eyes of the world. Yet her presence felt stronger than anyone else's. The billionaire's security team seemed unsure how to behave. Some glanced at Miriam with curiosity, some with faint unease, and others with the subtle superiority society had taught them. Wealth had that effect, creating invisible barriers, even when unintentional. But the billionaire himself saw past all of it. He stepped toward her, not with the authority of a man used to command, not with the distance of a man used to privilege, but with the humility of someone who had witnessed a miracle born from compassion. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The gratitude he felt was too large for words, too raw to shape into sentences. This was not a situation money could simplify. Before he could say anything, his daughter stirred in his arms. Her small hand brushed against his chest. He froze, tears filling his eyes. For hours he had feared that simple movement would never return. The room softened around them. Even the guards lowered their gaze respectfully. A medical specialist stepped forward. "Sir, she needs to be taken to the hospital immediately. She's stable for now, but she requires comprehensive care." He nodded, adjusting his hold on her carefully, then turned back to Miriam with a look heavier than apology, more like reverence. Miriam watched silently. She had no claim on them, no expectation of reward, no desire for anything except the girl's well-being. She had lived her entire life offering kindness in small, quiet ways, kindness that rarely returned to her. She never expected it to. Her heart never required it, but what she didn't know was that this night, this act, this shelter she offered, had changed the path of her life permanently. As they prepared to leave, the billionaire stepped outside first, shielding his daughter from the cold morning air. A convoy of black vehicles had arrived, their polished surfaces reflecting the sunrise. Reporters and cameras waited at a distance. Security guards spread out immediately, forming a protective circle. The neighborhood accustomed to struggle watched in disbelief. As luxury invaded their broken streets, Miriam stepped to her doorway, the soft light illuminating her tired but gentle face. She expected them to leave quietly, turning to a world where she would no longer be remembered. But the billionaire didn't step into the car immediately. Instead, he turned back. The entire entourage paused. He walked toward her again across the muddy ground, past the judgmental whispers of his own security, past the stunned eyes of onlookers, until he stood directly in front of her, and then in front of cameras, assistants, and his entire team. He bowed his head. A wealthy man bowed to a poor woman in a world where the opposite was expected. Gasps echoed across the street. He stood upright again, his eyes filled with something unshakable. He gestured toward her, home toward the small space that had saved his daughter's life, then toward his heart. It was his silent promise, a promise that what she had done would never be forgotten, a promise that her kindness would never go unnoticed again, a promise that the world would see her not as society labeled her, but as she truly was, a woman whose compassion transcended wealth, race, and expectation. The vehicles pulled away. Taking the billionaire and his daughter to safety, the street fell silent. Neighbors approached Miriam with stunned curiosity, praising her bravery, her kindness, her unexpected connection to someone powerful. But she didn't feel powerful. She didn't feel heroic. She simply felt grateful that the child lived. Days passed, then weeks. One morning, Miriam woke to the sound of engines outside. She stepped into the sunlight to find a group of workers, construction specialists, and planners standing in front of her home. A man in a polished suit approached her respectfully. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we've been sent to repair and rebuild your home, completely, at no cost to you." She was stunned. More teams arrived, medical staff offering free health checkups for the neighborhood, groceries delivered to her doorstep, educational supplies for children in the area, and renovation tools for families living in damaged houses. But the biggest shock came last. A letter arrived in an envelope with her name, written carefully on top. It contained a message: "Because of you, my daughter still lives. Because of you, I learned what humanity truly means. This world may judge you for your poverty or your skin, but not anymore. Not while I am alive." Below it was a promise of lifelong support, housing, health care, resources, protection. Not charity, not pity, but respect. Miriam held the letter close as tears filled her eyes. She had never asked for anything. She had given because her heart knew no other way. And in the end, her kindness had broken the chains of prejudice, wealth, and status, and the world around her began to change. Because sometimes, the smallest home shelters the greatest heart, and the poorest woman teaches a billionaire what humanity truly looks like.